Well, an op-ed in the New York Times and reprinted in the New Zealand Herald this week points to a cultural tipping point. Those who argued that pornography did no harm are now admitting that conservative Christians were right. The radical left and libertarians are only now connecting the dots between the role that pornography plays and the harm that it does to attitudes and actions. Let's check it out. So back in 2013, we alerted you to a book, Into the River. It won a prestigious New Zealand Post Children's Book Award, a book, according to the New Zealand Herald, that was laced with detailed descriptions of sex acts, the coarsest language and scenes of drug taking, and which polarised the literary community. The book used expletives, including the C word, depicted drug use and sex scenes, including one where a baby mimics the sound of intercourse. The Herald on Sunday even decided not to print extracts as it would have offended some readers. And then more recently, we told you about a 9-year-old child in New Zealand who was shown this book by another child in the primary school library area. And if she can see it, that means that 5-year-olds can also see it. The book is How Do You Make a Baby by Anna Fisk. Let's have a look in the book, and let me warn you, the material is explicit and you may find it offensive, but I will keep it very short. Remember, this is for primary age, at 5 years and up. So it could be in your school library for your child to read. And then I did a McBlog 2 years ago about an 11-year-old in the US who spoke up at a school board meeting to read aloud from the illustrated romance for teenagers called Nick and Charlie that he had checked out of his school's library. And the story begins with two early teen boys stealing wine from their parents and proceeding to experiment sexually with one another. He tried to read it out at the school board meeting and wasn't allowed. People got offended. And then 2 years ago, the American Library Association released a list of a couple of the 13 most challenged books, they called challenged books aimed at teens during 2022. And challenged means basically people think they're inappropriate for kids. But the book proponents said that they blamed anti-LGBT prejudice for what it called the censorship. The problem was that each book contained sexually explicit content and other good reasons you wouldn't want your children reading them. It wasn't prejudice, it wasn't anti-LGBT as such. It was about protecting young people from explicit, age-inappropriate, offensive, and potentially upsetting material. But the American Library Association, and I'm sure most libraries in New Zealand, encouraged readers to show your commitment to the freedom to read by protecting these books. So let's have a look at the top books on this list. And maybe you want to check if they're in your local school library or council library. The first one is Genderqueer, a memoir written by non-binary author Maya Kababi, who prefers the pronouns em, er. It's ranked as the most banned book 2 years in a row because of its sexually explicit descriptions and illustrations. In one passage, Kababi writes about trying to figure out if she's a gay boy trapped in a girl's body or whether a third non-binary option exists. It includes graphic depictions of minors engaging in sexual intercourse, including oral sex. It's basically a book that could be mistaken for a how-to manual. It also talks about girls wanting to be boys, wearing chest binders and getting top surgery, and does in fact show drawings of a sexual encounter between a man and a young boy. It's highly offensive. Yes, I have seen it, and you do not want your child anywhere near this book. Then there was All Boys Aren't Blue, removed from libraries in at least 29 school districts in the US because of parental concerns about sexually graphic material, including descriptions of queer sex, according to Time magazine. Then there was The Bluest Eye, which contains sexually explicit material, lots of graphic descriptions, and lots of disturbing language, as well as an underlying socialist communist agenda. Then there was Flamer, which includes graphic descriptions of LGBT relationships. And then Looking for Alaska and The Perks of Being a Wallflower. They were both challenged. They tied for 5th place. They include graphic descriptions, sexual abuse, drug use, profanity. And then next on the library's list of 13 most challenged books is Lawn Boy, which reviewers say is a pedophilic work with exploitative and abusive elements that go beyond the swear words and the sexual passages. It describes oral sex between two 10-year-old boys. Well, let me stop there. You can see that pornographic material has long left the domain of just adults and is being targeted not only at teenagers but also at very young children. For far too long, we've been persuaded by the left and the libertarians on the right that pornography does no harm, that it's consenting, that to object to it means you're a prude and to get with the sexual revolution. Oh, and that it does no harm to children. And the notion of faithfulness in marriage and one sexual partner for life is just so yesterday. Well, here's the interesting thing. The very people who said that are now rethinking their stance and admitting that maybe we were right. There's an article that was reprinted in the New Zealand Herald this week, but originally it was from the New York Times. The Delusion of Porn's Harmlessness. The author is Christine Ember, who is a Catholic and is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where her work focuses on gender, sexuality, feminism, masculinity, youth culture, and social norms. She writes at the New York Times, has written for The Atlantic, was a columnist and editor at the Washington Post, and was named one of the world's top 50 thinkers by Prospect magazine 3 years ago. She's also the author of Rethinking Sex, a Provocation, which challenged today's modern sexual ethics. But it's fascinating that the New York Times, which is no bastion of conservatism, has published this speech. So she writes, "These days, virality is difficult to achieve, but the British OnlyFans creator Lily Phillips managed it this winter when she appeared in a documentary titled, 'I Slept with 100 Men in One Day.' The film, available on YouTube, followed Phillips as she planned for and executed the titular stunt, capturing everything from the shuffling feet of the men outside her rented Airbnb to her shaken visage in the aftermath of the deed. She said, 'It's not for the weak girls,' she told the filmmaker with tears in her eyes. She said, 'I don't know if I'd recommend it.' Excessive? Certainly. Off-putting? To some. But perhaps not unexpected, if one considers how inured American society has become to women's sexualization and objectification. So much so that extremism seems like one of the few ways for an ambitious sex worker to stand out. And then she gives the data on how pornography floods the internet and says a 2023 report from Brigham Young University estimated that pornography could be found on 12% of websites, posted on X, on Instagram, in comment sections, and in unsolicited direct messages. Defenders of pornography tend to cite the existence of ethical porn, but that isn't what a majority of users are watching. The porn children view today makes Playboy look like an American girl doll catalogue, one teenager wrote in 2023, and it often has a focus on violence and dehumanization of women. And the sites that supply it aren't concerned with ethics either. In a column last week, Nick Kristof exposed how Pornhub and its related sites profit off videos of child rape. Now, actually, speaking of that, one of our speakers at this year's Forum on the Family in August is Dawn Hawkins, who headed up a group in Cozy that took on Pornhub. And you need to hear what she has to say. But just continuing, in her new book, Girl on Girl, How Pop Culture Turned a Generation of Women Against Themselves, Sophie Gilbert critiques the mass culture of the 90s and 2000s, noting how it was built on female objectification and hyperexposure. A generation of women, she explains, were persuaded by the ideas that bodies were commodities to be moulded, surveilled, fetished, or made the butt of the joke. That sexual power, which might give some fleeting leverage, was the only power worth having. This lie curdled the emerging promise of 20th century feminism, and as our ambitions shrank, the potential for exploitation grew. And then she identifies the rise of easy-to-access hardcore pornography, which trained a good amount of our popular culture to see women as objects, as things to silence, restrain, fetishes, or brutalize. And it helped train women too. But while Gilbert is unsparing in her description of pornography's warping effect on culture and its consumers, she curiously is reluctant to acknowledge what seems obvious. Porn hasn't been good for us. While her descriptions of the cultural landscape imply that the mainstreaming of hardcore porn has been a bad thing, she pulls her punches. She writes, "I'm not interested in kink shaming, and I'm not remotely opposed to porn." Immediately after describing a 2019 study that found that 38% of British women under 40 reported having experienced unwanted slapping, choking, gagging, or spitting during sex. And that's the typical approach, isn't it? Identify the problem, but then completely deny the obvious solutions or the necessary acknowledgement that, yes, porn does untold harm. The article continues, despite significant evidence that a deluge of pornography has had a negative impact on modern society, there is a curious refusal, especially in progressive circles, to publicly admit disapproval of porn. Criticizing porn goes against the norm of non-judgmentalism for people who like to consider themselves forward-thinking, thoughtful, and open-minded. There's a dread of seeming prudish, boring, uncool, perhaps a hangover from the cultural takeover that Gilbert so thoroughly details. More generously, there's a desire not to indict the choices of individuals, women or men, who create sexual content out of a need or personal desire, or allow legislation to harm those who depend on it to survive. Exactly. I mean, the inclusive, diverse sexual message of anything goes and there are no sexual morals or standards, even if there is harm, is a typical libertarian and typical left approach, isn't it? That's why I say that political parties that are libertarian, such as the ACT Party now, they may be fiscally conservative, but they're not morally conservative. The ACT Party used to be social conservative, but not now. Their vote on virtually all the moral issues, abortion, euthanasia, gender ideology, LGBT issues, definition of marriage, conversion therapy bans, they're no different to the votes from the radical left parties. Now, the article continues, and here's the key bit. But a lack of judgment sometimes comes at the expense of discernment. As a society, we're allowing our desires to continue to be moulded in experimental ways for profit by an industry that doesn't have our best interests at heart. We want to prove that we're chill and modern, to skip the inevitable haggling over boundaries and regulation, and avoid potentially placing limits on our behaviour. But we aren't paying attention on how we're making things worse for ourselves. Philip's case is one example of how normalisation of pornographic extremes has made even lurid acts de rigueur. It's not hard to imagine a future that asks and offers more than we can imagine today. Most recently, the only people willing to openly criticise the widespread availability of pornography tend to be right-leaning or religious, and are instantly discounted, often by being disparaged as such. But cracks are beginning to appear in the wall, as shown by sources as varied as the recent, if quiet, revival of the anti-porn feminist Andrea Dworkin and the heartfelt podcasts of Theo Von, who frequently discusses his decision to stop watching porn. It's an interesting admission, isn't it? It was right-leaning or religious people who were calling out the harms of pornography, but nobody wanted to listen. But we were right. We've been proven correct over our concerns. The radical left and libertarians are only now connecting the dots. Now, the article says members of Gen Z seem more willing to openly criticise it than their careful elders. The Oxford philosopher Amia Srinivasan, whose Gilbert quotes in the introduction to Girl on Girl, notes this in her 2021 essay, Talking to My Students About Porn. Question, does porn bear responsibility for the objectification of women? for the marginalisation of women, for sexual violence against women? Yes, they said yes to all of it. It's exactly what we said when we presented the petition back in 2017, calling on politicians to investigate the public health effects and societal harms of pornography. Had more than 22,000 signatures. And in the petition, we said that social scientists, clinical psychologists, biologists, neurologists are now beginning to understand the psychological and biological negative effects of viewing pornography, both online and through media and video games. They show that men who view pornography regularly have a higher tolerance for abnormal sexuality, including rape, sexual aggression, and sexual promiscuity. Prolonged consumption of pornography results in strong perceptions of women as commodities or as sex objects. You know, pornography has a damaging effect on intimacy, love, and respect, and at its worst, it leads to sex role stereotyping, viewing persons as sex objects, and family breakdown. Research has also shown that children who are exposed to pornography develop skewed ideas about sex and sexuality, which leads to negative stereotypes of women, sexual activity at a young age, and increased aggression in boys. Now, at the time we presented the petition, the Deputy Chief Censor called for the government to put more options on the table for regulating online pornography. And he said, given New Zealand's acknowledged problems with sexual and family violence and the demonstrated harm caused by pornography that degrades, dehumanises and demeans people, particularly women, the choice for government and regulators must be about how far we are willing to intervene, rather than whether we're prepared to intervene at all. Well, what did the politicians do in response to our petition? Exactly. You see, if we want to tackle sexual violence, we must first admit the role that pornography plays and the harm that it does to attitudes and actions. In fact, this story is just from 2 weeks ago on Radio New Zealand. New Zealand has rates of sexual violence against teenagers above the global average, ahead of even Australia, according to new research, study published in The Lancet. I mean, that is shocking. It's not rocket science, is it? That there is a moral aspect to sex and how we behave and treat each other, because it's biblical truth. Pornography harms, and porn is a public health crisis rather than a private matter. When even left-wing media start calling it out, you know that perhaps we've finally reached a cultural tipping point. The next time you get criticised for having a viewpoint consistent with biblical principles, but opposed to the cultural viewpoint, don't back down. Our confused culture needs truth more than ever.